much more, I think, market acceptance, and maybe it's resignation or whatever of like, look, we're not going back to 3 or 4%, mortgage interest rates anytime soon.
So by the time you're 18 years old, you will have an account in the S&P 500 that's worth upwards of $50,000 to $60,000. It changes the game by getting everybody.
$500 assignment. People are telling you to get it turned around really quickly. With all of the pressures of making that happen, and then have a settlement like this is really tough. Wrongdoing. Episode 42 of Market Moves with Mark and Jeff. Jeff, good to be back with you again today. It's been a little bit, not our usual weekly schedule here, and excited to share some news from one of the hosts here, some exciting news with your recent attendance to the Board of Trustees, I think, meeting, but also your application to that group. And I think you have some news beyond that to share here.
They didn't reject me this time, which wasn't the outcome last year. It's sometimes, I think, oftentimes a multi-step process, but yeah, had been nominated by the NAA as a partner organization to the Appraisal Foundation to join the Board of Trustees. And it's interesting, Mark. They've got a pretty refined selection process. You start by submitting, basically a resume or kind of background bio on who you are, but then they have some written questions that they have you fill out answers to, things kind of to get your perspective on the current state of the profession and where it's headed and what the biggest needs are and that sort of a thing. And from there, it whittles down to, selecting Zoom interviews that they then go through for potential Board of Trustee applicants. And from that group, they whittle it down to, they had 13 people invited to come to in-person interviews at their Board of Trustee meeting in Cincinnati this last week to end up filling, I believe it was 9 vacant seats or nine openings or whatever. But they had 65 initial applicants, I think, that kind of went through this, weeding down process. But one of the things that's interesting is I don't know what they did, many years ago, but this has been kind of an evolution as to how they've whittled that down. And the reason it stands out to me is I see a much less formal process for other boards, like our state appraisal board, for example. It's just not this multi-step, multi-layer, and some of it's intentionally blind and kind of scored responses. I mean, they've consulted with some outside groups to get a pretty scientific approach, or at least as much as you can, in trying to identify the types of individuals that you want to have, on the board. And so it stood out to me as being pretty, refined and intentional in the way they go about that. Now, they ended up making a poor judgment by saying yes to me, but that part worked out, I guess, okay in the end. But I was fascinated by how systematic the approach is and all the hoops they make you jump through.
Yeah. Given the results, Jeff, I think I'd agree with you that they may want to take another look at that process that led to your appointment. But congratulations. I actually had the privilege of kind of getting an inside look with that process, the structure of it, not candidates are all, because I was working with a similar type organization trying to restructure how we considered candidates, and they were kind enough to share some tips and hints because they had just redesigned theirs and improved upon it. So cool to be part of that, and it's like dating, right? It's a numbers game. So you just, how many times I'm willing to apply more than you are willing to reject me, right? Is that about how it goes?
Yes, and that does ring true. I think I had to wear my wife out before she finally said yes as well. So I maybe what I lack in attractiveness and intelligence, I make up for in persistence, I guess.
I mean, on some level, this is the Market Moves MO as well. Right? We are going to keep loading content up until someone listens. Let's keep at it there. Well, congratulations to you. I think nobody gets these appointments, certainly if they are lofted forward by a respectable organization, in this case, NAA with you, just a lot of volunteerism, selflessness, and reputation that it takes to be in those positions. So kudos to you for doing that. And it's impressive. And I do think we're in good hands, despite my ribbing you.
Well, it's good for me. Somebody's got to keep me, humble and grounded here. But no, it really is. It's worth, I think, emphasizing. Like you said, you've talked about some of the challenges of like servant leadership or just volunteering. With your experience with the Institute's board, and this is, this is a non-paid position, but you really do gain a lot of valuable experience, and you want to be able to contribute and give back and help guide a profession forward that's been good to you for a long time and that you'd love to see be good and viable well into the future. And one of the things just really fun with the foundation is, so much of what gets talked about and focused on is residential real property appraisal, but they also have contingents of business valuation professionals, personal property valuation professionals, in addition to the real property on the commercial, on the residential side. But some of that stuff's just fascinating. Like I was talking with somebody there who works for the IRS as a personal property appraiser, and the stuff that they deal with and focus on it's really interesting from a valuation perspective and way outside of my my league or kind of realm of experience.
Yeah, by all accounts, BizVal and personal property valuation. I mean, these are like undersupplied. There's an undersupply of appraisers out there, so it's very different than the real estate realm that we see, where we often hear that there might be an oversupply at times. Certainly feels like there's an oversupply in the moment. And Jeff, on the call for like servant leadership that we talked about on the last episode, is it related to Appraisal Institute critique or professional critique one way or another, and the need for leadership always, to seek action, corrective action, or improvements wherever. I saw a quote coming from that episode that we recorded, and really applies a little to my life. I volunteer for a lot of things, not volunteering in my place of business. I thankfully get paid for that, but it often is hard, right? And the quote, I guess it just get to the quote, but the quote was that it's a blessing to be exhausted in a pursuit of your choosing. And, I think inherent in that quote is that, there is a lot of exhaustion and difficulty in pursuits that could be there that were not of your choosing. Just think the horrible scenarios of war-torn countries and that stuff sort of being brought to you. But just a reminder that we've got a lot of freedom here, and we get to choose where we devote our time. Generally, is following an area of interest or an area of opportunity, and so. I don't know. A good reminder for me, and as you get exhausted in your Board of Trustees work, maybe you can remember that you chose it.
Yeah, well, a good reminder that you did sign up for this pain and suffering that you're subjecting yourself to. But that is such a good point, Mark. And I maybe I had a conversation with you offline. I don't remember about this, but I had a friend who just concluded serving on a local charity board as the chairman of that board, and had another opportunity to serve in a different charity that was really near and dear to him. He lost his parents when he was young, and this is a charity that supports those that kind of in that scenario. And he was just saying, I've got a lot of responsibilities. Is it worth doing or not? And, so I kind of thought through and had this conversation with him. At the end of the day, it kind of came down to what you were talking about. I've never regretted saying yes to an opportunity, even though it was inconvenient. It almost always is, to provide some level of like volunteer service or leadership or whatever. But you can make a meaningful difference. You come out the better for it. I've just not ever regretted, making those sacrifices, even though they do lead to exhaustion and making you wonder at times, why am I doing this? And, it's all the harder when you're in the middle of a challenging circumstance or there's a lot of criticism. We talked, last time about the Institute and some of the criticism that's being levied there, right? And it's just, that stuff makes it even that much harder to say, man, why did I sign myself up to be focus of the criticism in addition to all of the time that I'm contributing and, not getting paid for and that sort of a thing. But even with that said, I've just, it's been worth the effort to do. And I'd certainly encourage people to get engaged or stay engaged that are, so yeah, I mean, there's value to it, and it goes both ways.
Yeah, you bet, Jeff. Well, I think good perspective, good advice. Congratulations on that. We've got just a lot of kind of random news in our show notes here that we go through. But one, I think, is I don't know if I call it a follow-up to the Appraisal Institute story that we referenced on the last episode, but it does involve the Appraisal Institute, and it was current president of the Appraisal Institute, Paula Konikoff's president's message that she sent out on May 14th. I think it's the most recent one that went out, and it isn't always that the Appraisal Institute will reference what I consider me and my ilk, which is the kind of dirt on the shoes appraiser with clipboard in their hand. Although I and my company don't use clipboards, but the idea is essentially the same. But sort of, I don't know if I wouldn't call it a love letter, but I think it would be a message directly to many that are probably frustrated in and around the residential space with the current controversy, with a lot of the issues that the Appraisal Institute has battled as it relates to residential. There's a lot of talk about AMCs here in the latest New York Times article, whatever the Appraisal Institute stance is on that. The Appraisal Institute has worked through the bias issue. It's just a whole host and variety of issues that face the residential appraiser. And, the Institute has worked to deal with those. But this president's message is speaking to them. Hey, look, we hear you. We appreciate all you're doing. What you do embodies who we are and want to be. We're working hard. Can't change the past, whatever that is, but we are certainly working our tails off in the future and present here to make the SRA, the residential designation and member, not just feel good, but represent them well in their pursuits within the industry. And it made me go back. I mentioned on the last episode, I'm sure a lot of people that listen to this know that I just finished up with board service there. But I was looking at the questionnaire I filled out to apply to be on the board. It was 2019 or something, and this message just made me think, I guess, about a perspective that I've got that is I think important for the Appraisal Institute or whoever is going to be successful in being the voice for the residential appraiser moving forward. And I've said before, I hope that's the Appraisal Institute. I think it is actually, but it's that the majority of appraisers are residential, and I think the Institute has like 10% of them are members, where commercial appraisers, I think it's like 50% are designated, something like that. So they serve a way larger swath of the commercial appraisers than they do the residential. And the MAI for a lot of MAI commercial designation for a lot of people mean more money. It means in income. And so with the like a designation for commercial, kind of generally defined and meaning more salary or income for folks. It's not always that the SRA means that for people, but SRA aside, we've covered this on this podcast, like by an enormous margin, the highest addressable market for like appraisal fee revenue is residential mortgage appraisal. And so it's just this huge area. And in good times, there's more work than there are appraisers. And, I think there's just such an opportunity for the Institute or whoever to help the mortgage appraiser be better at business, and the affiliation, whether it's designation or not, mean getting better at mortgage work. And I think, someone like the Institute would define that as a higher quality 1004 report, okay, that's fine. But is the client asking for a higher quality report? On some level, maybe, but not, not to the tune of more dollars. It doesn't seem, but how do you execute business? How do you grow your practice if there's more work out there? And, Perea, how do you add a new license into your company and do that profitably? How do you support adjustments quickly and get through reports faster? And, all those sorts of things that are out there. How do you gain more business? Those are the things to me that really would speak to the 40,000 residential appraisers that are out there that are clamoring for a better way. I think in a lot of respects. And I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there, Jeff. You and I have talked offline well before we started this podcast about the voice that needs to reach residential members, and what are they looking for? So I just thought I'd throw that up there to talk a little bit about and see what you thought.
Yeah, I love that topic, and that definitely strikes near and dear to both of our hearts, really, Mark. And there's just so much opportunity. I think a lot of people don't know what they don't know. I just had an interview with an appraiser today, almost been certified for 3 years, recognized at some point that the supervisor, was pretty good at certain things in the appraisal space, but not so good in others, and not affiliated with the institute, not the supervisor, I mean, and not really, seeking to gain the skill set that you're talking about, not just how do I write a good quality report, but how do I do all of the other business things well. But had just been in business for 30 years and had the kind of the relationship connections, right? But she was seeing that, his way of operating and saying, man, there are better things to be done here. And so there's just so much need, I think, for learning how to serve a marketplace better than, what traditionally or historically has been done. And I think you're right. I mean, the Institute is well positioned to have a leadership role for the mortgage appraiser on the residential side. But what's needed isn't just diving really deeply on a technical analysis of a demonstration type of report. It's understanding what the users of the appraisal actually need and care about. And we've talked with representatives on this podcast from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, not about this specifically, but at every conference they're at, they're clamoring, they're begging for appraisers to do the things you talked about, supporting adjustments, having market-derived support for anything that you're doing. And that doesn't have to take days and days to do. In fact, I don't think it should, but it needs to be done, right? And so if you don't know how to do it, who's there to teach you? And at the end of the day, the real value of a designation or an affiliation with a professional trade group or professional organization is in helping you provide service to the market better and more efficiently, than what you might be able to come up with on your own. And there's a big need. There's a real lack, I think, of leadership in that space for this contingent of appraiser out there.
Yeah, you bet. I had in this vein, like trying to make the SRA, this was probably well before 2019 that I had a silly little idea that I had vaulted up to their Appraisal Institute's residential project team. And it was like, hey, the SRA needs to be more valuable, meaning more work, kind of like the SRA. Like, why not find an appraiser into a portal where someone can find an appraiser and place the order compliantly directly to the appraiser there. And so you could only be on that panel if you're an SRA. That directly means more work, maybe, and so even more so than that find an appraiser page does. So anyway, I think a general thought, Jeff, I guess the point of me bringing this up is that a general thought that, how to help residential members and what do they need? I mean, in a lot of ways, like, hey, we all want to make more money, and how do we serve the market better in a way that allows us to grow our income, however that is. An individual working out of their home, just getting more work out, compliantly, confidently, quality, or bringing in a new license and how to do that. These are the sort of business advice that someone should be doing in helping appraisers with. And, what's interesting is you see over the last 5+ years, there's a lot of mastermind groups within the appraisal community that have really been successful on whatever scale they intended to build. But, that's why these appraisers are joining these things. It's like, hey, you're helping me. It's mostly business techniques and tactics that people are employing really well. And it's very specific to that. And I think folks like the Appraisal Institute and others are missing, that market because I think there's a real need for it.
I totally agree. And we started out talking about volunteer leadership. You volunteered me for a role within the Institute on at least serving on a committee, right? And I had made a similar, not the same suggestion that you had just talked about like the portal, but a suggestion of, if the designation means something to the market for the appraisal services and ultimately means more work for those with the designation, that's incredibly valuable to the organization and to those seeking the designation, right? And I think there's a struggle to understand how to connect those dots, but to the extent that there's mutual exchange of value for the holder or the participant of the the institute or any other organization, and it meaning additional work to them, that's an unserved or an underserved segment in the space, I think. And I think of simple or maybe kind of humble efforts along these lines that you've just articulated. NAA has a couple of conferences, and we just this morning I was on a committee call talking about the Las Vegas conference coming up, and they're offering a free come and learn how to. And some of it's kind of business related, some of it's like pathways to getting experience we've talked deeply about, but it's trying to share some ideas of how to help practitioners better run and use their business while welcoming new entrants into the profession. There's more than one way to do that, which we've talked about on here. But it's just interesting, that is kind of underserved in the space, but a real need and value for whoever kind of cracks that code of providing a meaningful exchange of value for the members.
You bet. Well, I thought the message from President Konikoff was nice and directionally really good. I think there's just more to the mission to serve the residential group, and I felt that way for more than 5 years, I think. So yeah. We'll see. So good stuff there, Jeff. We got a whole bunch of different kind of news topics that we can jump on. I just wanted to touch on quickly because we cover these sorts of things in our podcast here. The general economic direction and policy coming from this kind of chaotic White House that doesn't seem to ever stop with new news or some bold action that makes you question everything. And this today, as we're recording this quote unquote big beautiful bill is out there, and I certainly have not read every page of it. I guess my comments now, Jeff, are that I'm having a hard time keeping up with what's in it. I'm having an even harder time understanding why it is proposing some $2+ trillion yearly deficit with a hope, and maybe even $3 trillion, with a hope of earning or increasing revenue in such a way that makes that not a deficit. And it just doesn't feel very consistent with the excitement that I had leading into this. And then on top of that, I don't know if it's proper to interpret this or not, but it does seem like Elon Musk has taken a step back from Doge. And I don't know if that is, hey, it's set up and it's time to go back, or if it's, man, I'm frustrated, I can't do very much here, and let me go focus on these other things. Because I follow one of his companies really closely, Tesla, I know that they're trying to get this autonomous driving thing launched in Austin in June. So I think it's time for him to be focusing on that. That could be the impetus alone. But I don't know. I see on the U.S. debt clock that we follow, Jeff, it's like $462 billion. I think it was Elon himself in a cabinet meeting said $160 billion that have been saved. I don't know. We're not racing to $1 trillion. It doesn't feel like, and maybe that's an unrealistic expectation, but maybe an expectation that was set early on. So what do you think of all this?
Well, I'm losing a little bit of faith in the debt clock, at least its tabulation of the amount of savings, right? But there's an interesting correlation there with this proposed bill, the additional spending, the $2+ trillion deficit that it would propose. And Moody's just in the last week, downgrading the debt and risk rating for the U.S. Treasuries. And I haven't dived deeply enough to confirm this, but I can't imagine that those two aren't related to each other. If we're going to propose another budget, in spite of saying we're going to cut a bunch of costs and narrow that deficit, if we're not narrowing the deficit, and if anything, widening it, I can understand why a credit risk agency would look at that and say, yeah, that's probably adding more risk to where you've already got, relatively large outstanding debt in place. And so I've been a little bit surprised, and I think you may be right, Mark. I don't know if it's just how difficult it is to really, make meaningful changes to the blob in Washington to actually cut $1 trillion in spending. We've we've cited others, Brad Gertsner and others who said, look, if we just went back to pre-COVID spending, just go back to what you were before, you would essentially be balanced. And there's not, to this point, an appetite to make that happen. And we're seeing the interest rates reflect, I think, that lack of political will to make the cuts necessary. And I hope that something changes there, but I'm maybe losing a little bit of that hope.
It sure feels like if the deficit is going to be eliminated and the budget is going to be balanced, that it would take incredible intentionality at every second to do that. And I see some senators, congressmen kind of trying to hold the line there at probably great cost, and I think I appreciate that with what I see on the on the outside here, and having a real hard time keeping up with it all. So I just hope we don't lose our resolve for a momentary attempt to balance budget. It seems really important. We certainly need these trade deals to finish up. I think the real estate market needs them to finish up, and hopefully there is good momentum to do that.
You bet. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to the extent that we can, come out in that place, I think we can be in good shape. But what I do know the real estate market can absorb is additional risk, that's then reflected in increasing interest rates. That is not a totally unfeasible, scenario going forward. I don't think it's the likely path, and I certainly hope that's not what happens. But an increase in interest rates would really be devastating, to the real estate market.
Jeff, as we record this, I think rates are a tick under 7%. And, as bad as going up, they've sort of held at this nasty number. The stock market today, which is Wednesday, went down this afternoon. And so why are bond rates rising so much? I'm sure there's a lot of explanations for that. But, they're rising in what seemed like an unpredictable way to the general public. They immediately went down, I think, right after Liberation Day, where these reciprocal tariffs were put into place, and so look, automatically bond rates are coming down. That means I think Trump was immediately out saying, "Hey, pal, time to lower rates," and all this sort of stuff. Well, since then, bond rates have shot up, and not just in the U.S. but around. And my understanding is that there are just not nearly as many bidders for the bonds that the U.S. issues at auction, which they do every day or whenever it is. And these foreign entities that buy all this stuff, and federal stimulus that like U.S. stimulus that buys some of these bonds, there just aren't as many that are willing to do it for a lot of reasons. These trade wars are creating some of those reasons to not buy them. And so so bonds today, I think it was the 10 years sold at 5.21%, up from the expected 5.16. And it's just weakness in these bidding auctions. And there's not enough people that want to buy bonds. And that's a pretty important thing for us in the marketplace. So I think that's what's contributing to it. And when is that going to stop? I don't know. It feels like trade deals are going to need to solidify.
I think they really will, and I think that could be the thing that determines, some of the future going forward. Is, do we get a large scale trade deal kind of agreements worked out or not? If we do, I think that really helps. If we don't, I think that just leads to further instability. One thing that I am seeing, start to take place, though, is much more, I think, market acceptance, and maybe it's resignation or whatever of, like, look, we're not going back to 3 or 4%, mortgage interest rates anytime soon. And, with the interest rates, today being higher than they were even a year ago, I was talking to my brother who sells real estate, and he said, man, last year at this time, he could get people into a house at close to 6% or even into the 5s with some rate buy down. And when I just looked this, just as you were talking, I'm showing a 7.08% on the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. It's just, but the transactions are, still happening. It's somewhat anemic, it feels like, but you do have people saying, hey, I can't put off this transaction any longer, or at least those are the ones that are transacting in the market currently. I think we're seeing inventories increase, and the market's responding to a lot of these dynamics that are taking place.
marry the house, date the rate has not been a painless strategy over the last couple of years.
Boy, no doubt about that, because everybody assumed that we would quickly go back to where we were on interest rates. And I just don't know. I don't know that we will, but we talked quite a bit, Mark, about affordability, and we've looked at a lot of headlines around affordability, and we're surprised to see a consumer survey say, people were way more focused on the home price than they were on the interest rate as the driver of lack of affordability. And we're not seeing volumes come way down. But one of the articles, just headlines that we had highlighted that I saw, was a Zillow article saying, kind of for the first time, they're projecting a decrease in home values. Now, the projected decrease was like 0.9%. Like it's almost nothing over a 1 year period of time. My perspective on that simply is that when you have a change in market expectations, there's a psychology that's almost kind of a multiplier effect on what actually ends up happening. And if people's perspective is, holy crap, values are going down, then you have buyers sit on the sidelines saying, well, why buy today if I can wait and get it cheaper, next year or something? And it becomes a little bit self-fulfilling. We're not seeing that happen yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we did.
Well, Jeff, I think the national narrative that just sort of carries forward is, we've had a lot of talks about this, I think offline. It's like, hey, look, if you don't list this thing right, then you got to start lowering the list price, and good luck with that prospect and pathway. That is not the way to sell houses right now. And we had a Reddit anecdote make its way over to us that was I don't even remember if the market was stated, but that someone had made an offer on a house, and the listing agent came back to the offerer saying, hey, we've had a bunch of offers on this house. We are accepting highest and best at 5 p.m. today. And this prospective buyer said BS and offered $50,000 lower. And the seller ended up taking that, called their bluff, and stated that the borrower was bullying them. But this is an anecdote. This is not an anecdote you would have seen 12 months ago, for sure. And this is an indication of weakness, and this turning to a buyer's market pretty solidly.
It really does. I lived the reverse scenario. My wife and I weren't desperate in the market to buy something, but a house down the street that kind of had a few things we liked came up for sale in the middle of the pandemic. And so we said, oh, what the heck, we'll put an offer in and just see what comes of it. And so we offered 10 or 15 above the list price, knowing there were a bunch of offers, right? And so it didn't get it. Like, we got the rejection notice, fine. It's kind of, we weren't really that surprised that it played out that way. But it turned out that home ended up selling for, I think it was $60,000 or $70,000 above the list price, because same thing, they'd asked for the highest and best. But in that scenario, it really was a bidding war. Today, it's almost the opposite of that. It's bidding it down as opposed to up in the price that was accepted in your story you just told.
Jeff, if only you had written a personal letter with your $45,000 insufficient bid, you might have gotten it.
Yeah, pleading my case and please give us a house. Yeah, boy. Well, they've even outlawed, I don't know if outlawed, but they've discouraged that, because of a lot of this bias stuff, that they don't want people accepting offers based on what somebody looks like or some of the backgrounds. But that was a pretty common practice for a while. Yeah.
Jeff, I know we've moved over to housing, but I don't want to get too far away from the current legislation on the agenda. And talk about, it's an interesting idea, this $1,000 for every newborn American in the U.S. That would stay in a tax deferred account until that newborn citizen turns 18 and would have to be fully withdrawn by the time they're 31. It was an interesting idea. I think the reasons behind it is kind of try and maybe teach folks about the stock market and about investing and having a piece of America and its growth and all those sorts of things, kind of similar to the argument about home ownership. I thought it was interesting. We've heard I guess we are fans. The show is fans of Brad Gertsner. We don't know him, but he's pitched this idea for a while, and interesting to see that it's made its way in this bill.
Yeah, it really is. I think I can pull up that video if you want to watch it, Mark, or we can just keep talking about it if you want.
Sure, let's do it.
We'll see if I'm smart enough to. But here's Brad kind of laying out the expectation or kind of how this would work, and then I do have a few thoughts on it.
They're left behind. They don't have accounts that compound. We need to get them into the game. So it's $1,000 at birth, seeded by the federal government, but private accounts. 3.7 million kids born a year. They each get a private account. Think of it as a 401k from birth. And we have companies like Uber and Dell and many, many others, Oracle, NVIDIA, et cetera, who all say they'll contribute to the accounts of the kids of their employees. We have philanthropists, major philanthropists, who are donating billions of dollars to this if we set it up. We have states like the state of Connecticut or Ohio who will add to these accounts. And of course, parents will add to these accounts. So by the time you're 18 years old, you will have an account in the S&P 500 that's worth upwards of $50,000 to $60,000. It changes the game by getting everybody. This is the president's Main Street agenda. The White House is very much aligned with this. The Senate is very much aligned. You know, it's led in the Senate by Senator Ted Cruz and Haggerty and Booker, Warner, and others. A big bipartisan group, but Ted Cruz is helping to get this scored, helping to get it in the reconciliation bill. We got a lot of support in the House. Again, bipartisan support led by the Speaker of the House. So I fully expect that we're going to get this into reconciliation. Imagine this. If the president signs this into law as part of reconciliation on July 4th of this year, that means on our 250th anniversary, July 4th, 2026, we can have 40 million children, 40 million families. They can open up their phone and see their child owns a little slice of Apple, of Berkshire Hathaway, of Microsoft, etc. I think that's how we really make this a Main Street economy. We know this is the most powerful economy in the world. It's high time that we get everybody into the game, but not on the back of a bigger government agency or a big government account, on the back of individual accounts. Make everybody an owner in the upside of America. Warren Buffett would give that his stamp of approval.
All right, you keep us up to date on how that progresses.
Yeah, really interesting. I kind of like just hearing the firsthand account, from him describing, and obviously the passion comes through, from him on, like how this would go. It's really interesting, and interesting too that they're not just saying, hey, this is only going to be funded from from federal government and taxation, but they're talking about philanthropy. I can't even say that word right. But like, they're looking at bringing in private sources of funding to help, seed or get that kind of an initiative off the ground. You did comment on one, you pointed to one comment that was just comical, said, well, that's interesting. What did they say? It was starting a capitalist effort with a communist program or something.
Yeah, a socialist act. Giving
Right.
someone $1,000 to teach them about capitalism. Essentially, it's like, well, that's a pretty good point. But I don't know. We listen to a lot of these, now very successful venture capital types that love these markets. Investing obviously is a good thing, and I don't think many Americans understand it very well or have participated in actually participating and seeing how that works. Probably opens a lot of eyes, and I don't know. It's cool. I think an example of something cool that is that's happening this year, and we're sharing.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see if it actually gets through the reconciliation process. The budget that the president's proposed has been stalled a little bit. The only other thing I'd add there, Mark, is that I like the initiative, but I almost feel like it would have to be coupled with some level of financial education or training that was integrated into middle school, high school, that help people understand and have a better practical and real world experience of how investing works. We do a good job in some ways in the education system. We don't do a very good job in other ways. I've got a boy who graduated a year ago, and I learned nothing about how to file income taxes, very little in personal finance and investing and that sort of thing. And I just think if all you do is throw money at a problem, there's not a real good track record of that being successful long term. But if you can pair that with practical and real world education, and maybe augmented by simulated experience. I remember in college, doing a mock investment game where you get in and you do the research and it's kind of like practice investing in the real stock market. But those kinds of things kind of have to go with an initiative like this for it to ultimately be successful, I think.
You bet. You bet. Well, interesting. We wanted to highlight it there. And Jeff, man, where do we go here? Do we go with what I think is the second sort of settlement in an appraisal discrimination case? Do we go with the Pope's Chicago childhood home being taken off the market? Where do you want to go here?
Boy, we have a bunch of headlines that are just interesting, but not really content to dive deeply on. I will just maybe make one comment on this settlement with the appraiser. There was a bias case that's been filed and now recently settled, and there were two takeaways from that. This was a California case. One was that the ultimate settlement turned out to be that the appraiser had to pay the would-be borrowers a $75,000 cash settlement plus like an investigative fee reimbursement to this California state agency that investigated of an additional $15,000. So his cash payout was $90,000 on an appraisal assignment that I don't know what he charged for, but could have been in the neighborhood of $300 to $600. It may have been more or less than that. I don't know, but the point was simply that though these are rare, there's a fair amount of liability and risk involved with an appraisal, well beyond the fee that's that's collected, right? And I've seen a lot of the attorneys will say, hey, appraisers, put in your report like a limitation of liability of you agree to liability up to the fee charged or something, but in these court cases that just doesn't really hold water. It's silly to me that somebody because they felt like they were entitled to borrow money that they couldn't borrow are holding the appraiser liable basically is the reason for the loan not going through. But so that was one part, is just like the kind of the serious nature of the risk that can be involved with an appraisal where the fee is relatively low. The other part that was just kind of comical, I don't even know what that this will serve the purpose the judge was intending, but the other part of that settlement was the appraiser was required to watch a documentary about lowball appraisals, citing his case as one of the cases in the documentary. I was like, I don't know what good that's supposed to do. You've run him through the ringer for 5 years in this litigation, and watching this documentary is going to now cure him of any supposed bias or whatever in his analysis. But it was just funny.
Boy, yeah, I think newsworthy for sure. This is what I think maybe the second settlement. There's one in Colorado that I think is settled as well. And I've heard folks say, I mean, back then, whatever the average fee is for an appraisal, $400 or whatever, saying, hey, the you are not being paid, and the fee of the appraisal, doing the appraisal, is creating more than $400 of liability for you every time you sign your name to one of these federal documents and all of this. And I think that's a bit exaggerated, but a tip of the hat to an old friend, Ted Whitmer, who would tell me that in classes that I've attended with him. But, it is, the point there is that, man, $500 assignment, people are telling you to get it turned around really quickly, with all of the pressures of making that happen. And then, have a settlement like this is really tough. Wrongdoing, it may be proper if wrongdoing is found, but so there we are.
Yeah, interesting to see. The other thing that's interesting is there's been a lot of talk of appraisal bias out there, and to your point, I think one of two actual settlements that have gone through. In my experience looking at these, if there is any wrongdoing, it's more of a competence issue, and it hasn't been an appraiser overtly or even subconsciously trying to impose a limitation on a minority homeowner. It's been more the result of poor quality workmanship or something, if anything at all. But for all of the talk and noise that there's been very, very little in the way of actual settlements or things going through to the end. HUD's opened a bunch of investigations. We talked about that on a previous episode, and most of them have just kind of either been dismissed or gone unresolved because there just hasn't been glaring evidence of what the accusations have been.
Boy, been privy to or heard of different cases in watching HUD go through what they're doing is I don't know, does not follow logic in terms of trying to broker money exchange and that sort of thing. Anyway, I don't know. Well, maybe that's for another episode here, Jeff. But here we are. I just a bit of a fun headline, which was Pope Leo the 14th's house in Chicago. This is the first American pope, and his house was listed for sale. Coincidentally, at the time that he was selected as pope, no one knew that was happening, but has since been taken off the market. And maybe these folks are the owners are reaching out to the family to decide what they want to do with it. But some neighbors may end up with a museum next door.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I believe it was an investor that owned the property. It wasn't the Pope doesn't own it currently, but it was his childhood home from growing up, and so. It is interesting, what drives some of the basics of value, right? And so this was just a run-of-the-mill home in a typical neighborhood. I think it was listed, for $200,000 or something, on that order. But then as, he gets made the Pope and it's discovered that it was, actually his house. In fact, I think in this article, the listing agent said they got a call about it and didn't believe that it was actually who was now the new Pope's childhood home. So he had to do some confirmation to make sure that was even accurate. And then the owner since decided to pull it off, not sure what to do, citing, they may reach out to the Pope's family to see if they have an interest or want to do something. But yeah, I mean, maybe it turns up to be a shrine or an Airbnb or a museum. I don't know, but just interesting how something can change a home, that otherwise would have been totally nondescript in a neighborhood.
Yeah. It's not often that a single event really changes the value landscape for a property. I've heard, I think it's Dr. Randy Bell talk about the stigmatized properties and maybe like murder houses, from different very infamous circumstances and what that does to value. Anyway, just an interesting note from an appraisal perspective.
You bet.
Yeah, Jeff. So, a lot of different ways I think we could go here. We were talking a little bit about California with this discrimination lawsuit. I thought it was worth noting. We spent some time immediately after the Palisades fire, just kind of talking about some of the realities on the ground there. And one of those realities is the awful circumstance of home insurance leading up to those fires and the really difficult. I mean, some people maybe were just days or weeks from no longer having insurance or stopped having insurance right before those fires took place. But there is a headline here that California, we talked about this, but I think it's interesting to see the process in place that California approved a 17% rate hike by State Farm. They had applied for about a 22% rate hike for homeowners insurance. And so California listened, didn't quite give that much, but home insurance for State Farm has risen. I don't know, makes homes less affordable, I think, in the end. And it's just a really difficult environment all the way through.
It really is, and I'm watching this curiously too to see that do the increasing cost of home ownership, which we've also talked about, result in home price changes in markets like this too. But the alternative is if the state doesn't approve the rate increase, the reason that some of these went uninsured, as you talked about, Mark, was because State Farm specifically was cited as just not renewing insurance policies, and so some of these people were left holding the bag, not having an insurance policy in place. So that I presume they were shopping or hunting for something in the meantime, but at least having the option approved at the higher rate is better than not having the option at all, it would seem to me. And at some level, it does seem like it has to impact home pricing as these other costs of ownership get, just perpetually go up.
You bet. Well, Jeff, as we are nearing the end of this episode, is there anything else in the housing market that is, striking you to discuss here in the state of things right now?
I think we've probably touched on a lot of the headlines. The only other thing was a chart that you had shared with me, Mark, that basically It's just worth recapping because we've spent a fair amount of time on some of these charts and graphs. But the National Association of Realtors, NAR, had put out a chart showing basically that housing inventory was back up to kind of April of 2020 levels. So just at the very beginning or the onset of the pandemic, before the effects of the pandemic had really kicked in. And we've highlighted the local differences where housing supply is going up a lot more in the Sun Belt states and less so in some of the northern states. Nationally, we're kind of back to where we were before. And it's really interesting to see, statistics like this paired with Zillow's prediction of like the lowest possible, value decrease, that there could be. I remember headlines, coming out into 07 and before there had started to be value drops in 08 of, home price increase expectations, and then the prices, started falling through the floor, that just wasn't anticipated until that cycle had started. I don't know that we're on the precipice of that cycle starting, but I do know that, that affordability is an issue, and the change in home pricing may be more dramatic than even, than what Zillow's projecting in the moment. Rising inventories were generally going to lead to that, so far as it's, local market specific.
My view, Jeff, is that inventory levels pre-COVID were unhealthily low even then. So us getting back to those levels is still not health. We probably need more active listing inventory. And I think we're going to get there. It feels to me. So, here we go. I think we watch it, but it is really notable that we've now kind of crossed that threshold of because we were way below inventory levels pre-COVID for 4 years, almost 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So here we go. And I quick hitting a couple of headlines. Saw a report that real estate agent commissions since the NAR settlement are hardly changed. And I think change scares the heck out of a lot of people. And certainly this is not to say that they won't change moving forward, but what you often see is that those that would capitalize on a material change are propping up the headlines in chaos of the notable news headlines. And, and then things settle out and we get wherever we get, people adjust and sort of figure out how to keep things from changing too much, I think. So I will see where all of that goes, but I thought that was noteworthy.
Yeah. And as I've talked, with those in that space specifically, that's very consistent with what the headline says. And it's a really good point that you make, Mark. I mean, sometimes you're on a tipping point of a real paradigm shift. Sometimes you're on the tipping point of a nothing burger. It just doesn't really turn out to be anything. And it's hard to know until things play out, one way or the other. But this has not led to a massive drop in commissions. And, maybe that changes down the road, but the disclosures and the NAR settlement has not, had a material impact in what agents are making on commissions to this point.
Very good. Well, Mr. Jerome Powell, sir, from Market Moves lips to your ears, how about some rate cuts, buddy? I think it's time. Let's make this market move. I'm ready for it. I hope you are, Jeff. I know anybody listening to this and all of those in real estate generally, residential real estate for sure. Bring it on. Let's get there.
Jerome may not listen to President Trump, but he certainly ought to listen to you and I, Mark. I have no doubt of that.
Yeah. There you go. I don't know. Let's see where we can get. Well, Jeff, enjoyed it here. Look forward to the next one.
Appreciate it, Mark. Thank you much.